Today, we're going to be discussing agreement in principles and whether you need one before buying your property. Hello, welcome back to our channel and podcast. My name is Gemma, and here at WIS we talk about all things relating to money, mortgages and positive money mindset. So if that interests you, be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the thumbs up. It really helps with our YouTube algorithm and means that you won't miss out on any of our videos. On today's episode of Let's Talk Money and Mortgages, we have Ifti joining us. And for those of you who don't know Ifti is a trained accountant and mortgage advisor who's been in the industry for over 11 years, and he's also one of the founding directors here at WIS. Welcome back, Ifti. How are you doing today?
Hi, I'm well, thank you. How are you doing?
Yeah, very good, thank you. Today we are talking all about agreement in principles.
Yeah.
So I think it's probably a good place to start with explaining what is an agreement in principle.
So agreement in principle is, in principle, the bank tells you how much you can borrow. So for example, if somebody is earning, say, together they're earning, say, 50,000 as income, and then they tell the bank, okay, I'm earning 50,000. These are my financial commitments, and these are my additional income. Based on that, the bank tells you how much you can borrow. So that's known as an agreement in principle. So in principle, they say that this is how much you can borrow. So that's called an agreement in principle. At this stage, they do not look at any documents, right? So they just go by what you say. So you have to be very accurate with the numbers that you give, because otherwise the answers will be different.
Definitely. And some people kind of say a decision in principle. Now, is a decision in principle the same as an agreement in principle, Ifti?
Yeah, it's one and the same. So I hear these terms, right? Agreement in principle, banks call that decision in principle. Again, banks use that term as well. Some people call it as a principle in agreement, right? So banks generally don't use that word, but it's all referring to the same thing, right? So in principle, how much is the bank willing to lend to you based on the information you told them, right? So that's what it means.
All right. And Ifti, what kind of information will you need to supply when you get an agreement in principle or a decision in principle?
Basically, you don't have to supply anything, right, to get a decision in principle, provided you give the correct answers. So that's kind of what it is. But there's a big but there. You have to be very honest with what you do, because if you give wrong answers, you'll get a wrong result, right? So for example, let's use the same example as before. Somebody is earning 50,000, but it's not quite 50, it's 49,500, right? So if that's the case, if you tell the bank that I earn 50,000, the bank will go with that and give you a decision in principle, because they're not looking at the document, right? Or a broker, right? So they'll do the same. But then when it comes to the real scenario, when you have to make an application and you give the pay slips, if that doesn't add up to 50,000, then you have a problem to start off with. And also, on your pay slips, if there are certain deductions, right, pensions, some people put money to buy shares, there can be various deductions on your pay slips. So each bank looks at that in a different way, because some people take it off your pay slip saying, you know what, you're committed to pay pensions, so we don't want to add that, right? Or you're committed to pay, buying shares, so we don't want to add that, so they will deduct that. So that's why I said just be honest and provide the information so their answer is accurate. And also, it's always good to look at a credit file, right? So provide your advisor or the bank a credit file, because they can go with the numbers on the credit file. Because sometimes, I find that people have mispayments, that would have been 4 years ago. But some banks are okay with it and some are not, right? So if we did go to a bank who looks at one who is okay with that, and later on we find a better deal at some other bank, your answer, you might not get a mortgage with them, right? So it's always good to provide this information. Of course, as advisors, we do ask for passport as well, because usually people sometimes change names. All these can have impact on your credit file, right? And that can have impact on your mortgage. So try to give as much information as possible so that you get an answer which is as accurate as possible, right? So that's kind of what it is.
Getting your mortgage online doesn't have to be complicated. At WIS, our website will help guide you through step by step. Our fully qualified advisors can help you get the most suitable mortgage for you. Then you can relax, safe in the knowledge that WIS are working in the background to get your mortgage approved. WIS. Online mortgages made simple.
Now, Do you need an agreement in principle before purchasing a property?
No is the answer. You don't, right? But there's good reasons for you to do that, right? So that's why I think it's important you do that. Okay, so for example, let's say I'm earning 100,000, right? And I don't have any commitments, quite young as well, let's say. For me, I might not need a decision in principle because I'm only trying to, let's say, borrow 200,000 from the bank, right? So you might not need because the numbers looks like it's adding up, right? But what happens is, if you don't know, right, if you're a first time buyer, you're going to buy a house, right? You want to know how much you can borrow, right? So for that, best thing is to run a decision in principle. Then you know, okay, in principle, how much is the bank willing to give you, right? So that's the important thing here. So that's why it's always good to run one and see, because also the issues we find is sometimes people come and say, no, you don't have any credit issues, right? It's very common people say this, but again, they would have missed a payment 4 years ago, like I mentioned before, right? And the bank might not like it. So it's always good to run one to see where your status is. And also it gives an advisor or a bank, whoever you're using, time to analyze you and see whether this is the right thing for you as well, right? Because the other day I came across a client, right? I wasn't very comfortable doing a mortgage with him. Although the affordability added up, I don't think it was very responsible if I had recommended a mortgage, right? So all those things will come into play if you're trying to do this. So it's always best to do sort of some kind of analysis and do a proper decision in principle. So that, gives you a good idea as to where you stand, right? So, but yeah, the answer is you don't need one, but in most instances, it's always a good idea to do one.
Yeah, thanks, Sifty. And also, sometimes estate agents ask for one, don't they?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah. So a lot of estate agents do ask for one because they just want to know whether it's true. Because especially in a seller's market, right, where the seller, I think at the moment it is a bit like that.
Yeah.
The seller, can determine a lot of things. So if you don't have a decision in principle and somebody else has it, let's say go with the other person because they are more likely to get a mortgage than you, right? So that's a very, very good point. I think I'm glad you brought that up. So I think, yes, estate agents do ask that. So it's always a good idea to have one.
Yeah, because sometimes they like to check the affordability, because in your head you might think that you can afford, 500,000, but then unless you've got an agreement in principle to prove it, then sometimes they might not like that. So what do you need then before running a decision in principle? Do you need to do anything?
Again, it's always a good idea to download a credit file, have a look at it, right? And see where exactly you are, right? See whether there's mispayments, sometimes silly stuff, right? For example, one of my clients some time ago, clean record, he was trying to buy a house. Previously, he moved house. So, and he had got a parking ticket, but the parking ticket was going to his old address, right? So he wasn't aware there was a sort of county court judgment passed against him, which he was not aware. So, he was happy to come and apply for a mortgage, but he couldn't because he's got a county court judgment, right? So if you look at things like that, sometimes you can rectify this before. Because it wasn't his fault, they managed to sort of get that reversed, right? So, I mean, it did take some time, but they managed to get it reversed because it wasn't his fault, because he wasn't aware. So things like that might come to light. So it's always good to go through your credit file and, be honest about your stuff, like I said, right? Bring your pay slips, meet an advisor, especially if you have deductions, show it to an advisor and say, look, is this going to cause problems, right? And also, issues like sometimes agreement in principle is not the only thing you need to look at. Banks look at your deposit, they look at your bank statement. It's always sort of good to sort of go through these things as well, because agreement in principle, like I said, it's only an agreement in principle that you can borrow, right? It's subject to underwriting and various other checks, right? So it's always good to do some of these things upfront before you apply for a mortgage.
Yeah, thanks, Sifty. So last question today is kind of a very popular question, actually. Will running an agreement in principle or decision in principle affect my credit score?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's a very popular one as well, right? Because there are sometimes people come and say, look, I want to do a mortgage, get a mortgage, but I'm sorry, you can't run a decision in principle, right? When you ask why, they say like, no, it's going to affect my credit score, right? Yes and no, it can. Because certain lenders do hard credit searches. Certain lenders do soft credit searches, right? So depending on who you're using, it can have an impact on your credit score, right? Now, for most people whose credit scores are excellent, right? Even if you run a hard credit search, it may not have a problem because your credit score is excellent, right? When I say excellent, I'm talking about, say, maybe 999 or something very, very close to that, right? Because if you're doing a mortgage application, you've got to run an agreement in principle, right, to know how much you can borrow, right?
Yeah.
But my advice is try and run it with a bank who does a soft credit search. If you're just running one just to show the estate agent saying, oh, I actually can afford a mortgage, do one of them, right? Try and avoid those ones which are difficult, right? But so for some people, there is no choice, right? It's only that lender who will give you that money, right? Because the other day I had a client, he earns in foreign currencies, right? He's sort of UK based, but he earns in foreign currency. Very few lenders were happy to give him the money. He had to run a reasonable principle. That particular bank, it was a hard credit search, right? He doesn't have a choice, right? Because otherwise you get wrong answers, right? So there are certain instances where you can't avoid it. Again, get advice on this, right? But generally, if you have a very good score, it shouldn't have too much of an impact. But if you're not sure, please always speak to an advisor because they can guide you on this.
Definitely. Well, thanks again, Ifti, for some more great advice. I will just put a reminder out there that these points may or may not be applicable to everybody, so please do check with an advisor if you're unsure if they're suitable for you. And if you don't have a broker, I will leave our WS contact details below, as we're always more than happy to help. Another little reminder that as your mortgage is secured against your home or property, it may be repossessed if you do not keep up with the mortgage repayments. Thank you for joining us again today. We'll be back next week with another episode of Let's Talk Money and Mortgages. Have a great day, stay safe, and we'll see you again soon.